In Chapter 2, the Union Army crossed the Mississippi on April 30, fought a battle the next day at Port Gibson, and then on May 3, occupied a new supply depot at Grand Gulf. Also, General Grant decided to ignore direction from his superior, General Halleck, to turn south and join General Banks at Port Hudson. Grant decided instead to push forward into Mississippi and continue his campaign to capture Vicksburg. The U.S. Army training document dated 2001 summarized General Pemberton's strategy at this point. Pemberton steadfastly refused to bring out the garrison of Vicksburg, even temporarily. President Jefferson Davis had instructed Pemberton to defend Vicksburg, and Pemberton was inclined to interpret that guidance quite literally. Pemberton's plan was to stay in his defensive position on the Big Black, maul Grant's army in a defensive battle, and only then to take the offensive to drive the Federals from Mississippi." Unquote. Notice that from May 3 through May 8, Grant's army pretty much rested in place. Grant used this time to gather his reinforcements, to perform reconnaissance, and to decide which way to move from here, whether to push straight north to Vicksburg or northeast to the railroad between Edwards and Jackson. On May 5, Sherman's Corps was still on the west side of the Mississippi. McPherson's Corps was at Hankinson's Ferry, and McClernand's Corps was at Willow Springs. General McClernand was ordered to recon to the northeast towards Edwards, and General McPherson to the north towards Vicksburg. The reports that came back indicated that on the direct route north to Vicksburg, there were fortifications and strong Confederate troop concentrations. On the other hand, infantry patrols to the northeast as far as Hall's Ferry and north of Auburn found very little. The conclusion was that as of the evening of May 6, the Confederate troop concentrations were at Warrenton and the Edwards Big Black Bridge area, with a small body at Jackson, and there's also General Johnston with a small force rumored to be approaching from the east. McClernand's recon to the northeast also indicated that the roads between Grand Gulf and Edwards were good, and Grant decided to turn northeast toward the railroad. The plan was for McClernand's Corps, the Red Arrow, to parallel the Big Black River and guard the left flank. McPherson's Corps, the Blue Arrow, would diverge to the east and travel through Utica toward Raymond, and Sherman's Corps, the Green Arrow, would take the center through New Auburn. This three-column march would put Grant's army on a 6-mile front running east-west. They would move north and strike the railroad at Edwards Station, Midway Station, and Bolton Depot, and then they would turn west toward Vicksburg. To make this work, Grant needs to reposition his three corps. He wants McClernand on the left, Sherman in the middle, McPherson on the right. But on the end of May 6, McClernand and McPherson's Corps were in the reverse of what was wanted. McClernand on the right at Willow Springs when he's wanted on the left. McPherson is on the left at Hankinson's Ferry when he's wanted on the right. And Sherman's Corps is on the other side of the river. According to Grabow, Pemberton is convinced the Big Black River Bridge is the U.S. objective. Pemberton decides to move his army to Edwards and fight a battle to defend the river crossing on the ridges south of town. Around May 6, Pemberton shifts his two best divisions forward to defend the line you see here, from Warrenton to the Big Black River Bridge. And on May 6, the Union troops' movement to the northeast started. McClernand's Corps moved forward to Rocky Springs. And also on May 6 and 7, the first two of Sherman's divisions, Tuttle's and Steele's divisions, crossed the river at Grand Gulf. On May 8, Gregg's Confederate brigade, which Pemberton ordered up from Port Hudson, arrived at Jackson. On May 9, McPherson's Corps splits off to the east, taking their position on the right of Grant's column. On May 10, McPherson left Utica for the Weeks Plantation, and McClernand's corps rested at Big Sandy Creek while Steele's division left Hankinson's Ferry and caught up with the Army. And Grabow wrote, "There had been cavalry bickering all across the front all day, so it was clear that Pemberton was aware of the movement. There being no hope of surprise, Grant had no choice but to press on, hoping that speed would substitute for subtlety." Unquote. Pemberton's cavalry was in touch with the front of Grant's advance. Pemberton knew that the Union forces' front ran all the way from Big Black River to Tallahatchie Creek. Pemberton didn't see Grant following three separate lines of advance. He believed that Grant's main force was concentrated on this line: Rocky Springs, Cayuga, Edwards. And we know that's generally the line McClernand's corps was following, on Grant's left flank. Pemberton believed that the contacts out east toward Auburn and Utica were just flank guards. But of course, in fact, that's McPherson's corps. Pemberton decided he'd use the reinforcements he'd received to attack Grant's right flank. Accordingly, on the evening of the 10th, Pemberton ordered Gregg's brigade to move to Raymond. On May 11, Sherman's corps passes through McClernand's corps and takes their intended position in the center of the column. And see on the morning of May 12 that Grant's front line is inched forward to about the line Cayuga, Auburn, Utica, and the last two divisions of the 10-division Union force are on their way forward. MacArthur's division is on their way downriver to Grand Gulf, and Blair's division has landed at Grand Gulf and is about to start their march to catch up with Grant's army. Grant continued to struggle with his long and fragile supply line. As Grabow wrote, there simply was no way in which the 40,000 men and thousands of horses of his 8-division maneuver force could be fully supplied with food and forage brought over that route. Unquote. Grant and Sherman debated the issue at long range, messaging back and forth. Sherman wrote at 4 a.m. on May 9 from Hankinson's Ferry, "Stop all troops till your army is partially supplied with wagons, and then act as quickly as possible, for this road will be jammed, as sure as life, if you attempt to supply 50,000 men by one single road." Unquote. Grant at Rocky Springs responded later that day, May 9. Here's part of what he said. "I do not calculate upon the possibility of supplying the army with full rations from Grand Gulf. I know it will be impossible without constructing additional roads. What I do expect, however, is to get up whatever rations of hard bread, coffee, and salt we can, and make the country furnish the balance." Unquote. In other words, Grant's army would be foraging, and that's one reason why his army will spread out onto 3 separate tracks, Sherman in the center and the other 2 corps on his left and right. A marching column would strip bare the countryside 6 or 8 miles across as it marched along. The lead division would do fairly well. The divisions following would find slim pickings. So the army needs to spread out so that each column has fresh countryside to feed on. On May 10, Confederate General Loring, one of Pemberton's division commanders, telegraphed to General Pemberton a proposal for a 4-pronged strike on Grant's army. I see no reply to Loring's proposal, but there is this message, dated that day, May 10, from Pemberton's headquarters to Generals Loring and Stevenson. The Lieutenant General commanding directs me to say to you that he finds great difficulty in having his views comprehended and wishes to see you at once personally. Unquote. On May 11, McClernand's corps moved forward to 5 Mile Creek, while Sherman's corps leapfrogged ahead to Auburn, taking position in the center of Grant's column. And McPherson moves a few miles forward to find water in Tallahatchie Creek on the 11th. The next water is in front of them at Raymond, which is where McPherson's Corps will go on the 12th. And also on the 12th, McClernand's Corps will turn north towards Edwards, and Sherman's Corps will continue northeast. General Pemberton believed that Grant's next goal was the bridges on the Big Black River, across which Grant could reach the city's rear. As I mentioned, he believed the Union infantry that Confederate cavalry was watching off toward the east near Raymond was a flank guard, probably just a brigade. And Pemberton had forces available in the area and came up with a plan to overwhelm that lone brigade and drive into Grant's right flank. The problem, of course, was that this Union force wasn't a brigade, it was McPherson's infantry corps. A brigade might be 1,500 men. McPherson's corps was nearly 10 times that. When the Confederates attacked, they would be badly outnumbered. Gregg's brigade is estimated at 3,000 to 4,000 men, and he expects to be reinforced by Walker's brigade. Raymond is a road junction, a lot like Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. On the map here, you see 4 roads that join at Raymond, from the northeast and northwest, southeast, and southwest. And Raymond is also a Confederate commissary depot, which McPherson's Corps wanted to capture in order to supplement their increasingly slender rations. On May 11, Gregg's Confederate brigade moves forward from Jackson to Raymond, and they arrive about 4 p.m. And Gregg's instructions were to, quote, brush aside the flank guard that was marching up the Utica Road toward Raymond, and then turn and strike into the flank of the Federal force, unquote. On May 12, Grant's army lunged forward from west to east, first, to the southwest, the last of Grant's 10 frontline divisions to cross the river. MacArthur's division is ferried from Mrs. Perkins' plantation across to Grand Gulf. They won't catch up with the army until May 18. Next, McClernand's Corps, Grant's left flank. Smith's division captured the Montgomery Bridge across 14 Mile Creek. Just to the east, Hovey's division ran into resistance from Bowen's division, including artillery, south of the creek, but forced their way across and all the way to Mount Moriah before retiring back to the south side for the night. Sherman's 2 divisions, the center of Grant's column, forced a crossing of 14 Mile Creek on their front. Tuttle's division camped at Dillon's Farm, and Steele's division about a mile to the west. Logan's division led the way from McPherson's Corps on the march toward Raymond on Grant's right flank. They started at 3:30 a.m., and almost immediately, the Federal cavalry leading the march was under fire from skirmishers. They pushed forward for 8 miles, resistance building slowly. About 2 miles south of 14 Mile Creek, General Logan threw out an infantry battle line, and they led the way, pushing forward for another 1.5 miles until they crested a ridge a half-mile south of 14 Mile Creek. It was then about 10 a.m., and Confederate artillery posted on the far side of the creek opened fire. And General Logan brought forward artillery of his own, and the battle was joined. This battle seems a lot like the battle at Port Gibson, where the Confederates faced a column of Federal infantry that badly outnumbered them. J. Parker Hills, in an article in the collection The Vicksburg Campaign, records the opposing numbers as 14,700 on the Union side, 3,200 on the Confederate side. As more and more Federal infantry marched up and joined the battle, the Confederates were forced to extend their flanks further and further while being forced back. Eventually, Gregg found a viewpoint where he could see out over the battlefield and realized then that his Confederate brigade was facing an entire Union corps. Generals Sherman and Grant were sitting together listening to the battle at their camp at Dillon's plantation about 5 miles to the west. Hills wrote that Grant's experienced ear told him the battle was not too big for McPherson to handle, so Grant sat patiently and waited for news. And according to Hills, quote, by 4 p.m., the surprisingly ferocious battle came to a conclusion when Gregg skillfully disengaged his regiments and retreated east toward Jackson, unquote. The fight at Raymond was an alarm bell for Grant. Remember, the current plan is to wheel north and attack the railroad and then turn west to Vicksburg. McClernand and Sherman had already turned north, and McClernand's infantry was in contact that day along 14 Mile Creek. Warren Grabow writes that Grant considered the Confederate force just defeated at Raymond, plus intelligence that told him of more troops on the way from the east, plus the approach of General Joseph Johnston. If he turned west towards Vicksburg, he was leaving all these forces in his rear, and Grant decided he needed to insert his army between these forces before they could combine, and then he could defeat them one at a time. So, attack east or west. Attacking to the east offered a twofer: defeat the force General Johnston was building, and also destroy the city of Jackson and its industries and the railroad and telegraph lines. Destroying Jackson would make capturing Vicksburg easier, and because Jackson was an industrial center, destroying it would also be a blow to the war-making potential of the entire Confederacy. According to Grabow, quote, Grant made his decision within the hour, unquote. His order directed McPherson to march on Jackson via Clinton and ordered Sherman to march on Jackson via Raymond and Mississippi Springs. McClernand's task was to disengage from the fight with Bowen's division and escape to the east before Bowen had a chance to interfere, and then McClernand would march east to Raymond and be ready to support the other two corps at Jackson if needed. McPherson would pass through Clinton and approach from the northwest with Logan and Crocker's divisions. Sherman would approach from the southwest with Tuttle's and Steele's divisions. There were good north-south roads connecting the Raymond and Clinton roads, so McPherson and Sherman maintained a steady flow of courier traffic back and forth to share information and coordinate their approach. Confederate General Johnston arrived in Jackson late on the 13th and met with General Gregg. At first, he saw an opportunity to attack the Union Army front and rear. Johnston would attack west from Jackson. Pemberton would attack east from Edwards. General Johnston sent Pemberton a message at 9 p.m. on the 13th, suggesting Pemberton attack the Federal forces at Clinton. But then, in a matter of a few hours, General Johnston changed his mind. Early in the morning of May 14, he ordered Jackson, the Mississippi state capital, evacuated, and ordered General Gregg with his 6,000 men to hold the enemy back until the city was cleared. The numbers I have for U.S. forces at the Battle of Jackson come from Chris Makowski in his book, The Battle of Jackson. Adding together his numbers for Sherman's and McPherson's corps, I come up with 22,781. And Stephen Woodworth, in his chapter of the book, The Vicksburg Campaign, reports Gregg's command at 6,000 men. General Gregg positioned most of his forces to the west of the city, and he apparently did not know about Sherman's corps approaching from Raymond on the southwest. The Confederate troops managed to delay the inevitable for several hours by retreating from one position to another. Finally, around 2 p.m., Gregg was told that the evacuation of the city behind him was done, and he pulled his troops out of Jackson, and they followed General Johnston to the north. That afternoon, while celebrating the capture of the city, Grant got a copy of General Johnston's most recent order to Pemberton. And Grant learned that Pemberton is moving east and Johnston might try to join him. So Grant is still facing two armies, Johnston to his northeast, and Pemberton to his west. Johnston, we now know, had about 6,000 men. Pemberton had about 33,000 men, and Grant had a bit more than 40,000 men. Grant decides to ignore Johnston's force, leave Sherman's corps in Jackson to finish destroying the Confederate supplies and facilities there, and go west with his other two corps and attack Pemberton's army west of Bolton. General Pemberton responded to Johnston's message of the evening of May 13, agreeing to attack Grant's army at or near Clinton. And according to Timothy Smith in his book Champion Hill, Pemberton's army at this point totaled about 33,000 men. Pemberton left Forney's and Smith's divisions in Vicksburg to defend the city against an attack from west across the river, and moved east toward Edwards with the remaining 24,000 men. But then quickly had second thoughts. General Pemberton called a council of war and decided, instead of cooperating with Johnston to attack southeast against Grant's supply line, they would aim for a point between Auburn and Raymond. It was a 10-mile march and should be doable in one day. Next, the battles of Champion Hill and the Big Black River Bridge.